authentic genius and live the life you desire.
You are now listening to
Join Dr. Rademaker for an enlightened conversation about our brain intelligence, our body intelligence, and our energy intelligence. And now, here's your host, Dr. Bart Rademaker.
So welcome. I'm Dr. Bart Rademaker, prescription for your transformation, real people, real conversations, and real success. And so the real people on this show today are all of you listening, whether it's today or sometime in the future. Really excited about this technology so that everyone has quick access to old stuff, and all that old stuff can actually become new stuff for you. And that's the whole point. That's the whole point in all of this. And let me just make sure that I am not totally connected here. It's always that same glitch. Let's see. Go live. I think that's the key here. All right, there we go. So I think we're going live here. I got too many areas that I'm going live on. And I'm doing all this solo all the time, of course. But I've got my checkpoints to make sure that I know that I'm doing it right or not. So I'm live streaming on 5 platforms. Imagine that. So that's the cool thing about my creative spirit, because I really try to do things out of the box. And I'm that super achiever. And so what is today really all about? Today is actually the beginning of a program that I'm putting together called, Prescription for Your Transformation. So I've been talking on this platform for the last 3 to 4 years, interviewing some really amazing people and bringing to you all sorts of different insights that could absolutely transform your life. And it just takes one idea to really begin that snowball effect. Just one idea that is such a breakthrough in your life that suddenly, all these other things kind of make sense. And interesting enough, this is something that consistently happens in my life, is that I come across these new ideas and suddenly everything makes sense again, or makes sense at a different level of consciousness. And so what's interesting, though, with any kind of personal development, personal growth, expansion, if you will, is really understanding first, what is it that we need to change? I mean, as Einstein said, you can't really change anything until you really understand, what it is that we need to change. And his other phrase, which is amazing, is you can't solve the problems with the same knowledge that created them. You have to develop a new level of understanding, a new level of knowledge or consciousness to resolve and solve the problems that you have. So for this program, where we're really starting off at is understanding how we got here and exactly how we got here. Because the truth is that unless we start understanding the particular issues that got us to where we are today, it's going to be pretty hard to change. I mean, you might actually get lucky. You might actually get your breakthroughs because they just will happen. But it'll be so much faster if you have an understanding as to where you are today and how you got here. Now, what I mean by that, it's not about going into the depths of your mind and figuring out all the muddle that's happening in there. And I like to call it a muddle because oftentimes it is. But it's really about understanding the structure, of our thinking and how our thinking has developed over times. And so one of the first things that I like to share off is this. What is that genetic code? Didn't expect that one, did you? What is our genetic code? Because that is the blueprint of our entire body. But understanding the genetic code is critical, because for a very long time, and still even for many today, the thinking of the genetic code is what causes everything in our body. And that's not exactly true. What we have to understand is that our genetic code says basically 22,000 genes. isn't that far off from the Anopheles fly. And so the different, sequences of the DNA, really can't explain the vast difference between the human body and the Anopheles fly. And so when they started doing the research and they first found the DNA, the genes, they weren't paying attention to the fact that what they were measuring was only 50% of what was there. You see, by weight, when you look at the genetic material, the nucleus, it only accounted for 50%. And no one bothered to look at the other 50%. And so that's when the study of what's called epigenetics came to play. And that's around the genes. And so the other 50% in the weight are all the proteins. These are the messengers, in essence. You see, at first they thought, well, okay, this material are just the messengers going away, from our DNA, making the proteins and the enzymes and all sorts of things. And so what they didn't realize, and we realize now today, that what's happening is that the messengers going to the DNA, going to your chromosomes, have a very significant impact in how the chromosomes are being expressed. And so we then discovered that with the 22,000 genes, there are actually about 2 million switches. And a switch switches the gene on or off. And now you can understand, the incredible variety of combinations that is possible, and now explains the difference between all these different species. But what's relevant in those switches is that whatever your makeup is today, in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, you can kind of blame your parents and your grandparents, because what happened with their lifestyle, their choices in life, really began to determine how those switches were turned on and turned off. And so when you're born with these switches, whether they're turned on or turned off, and have this very significant impact in the structure of your body and how your body actually functions. And so that genetic code, to understand that, to appreciate that, is going to be helpful for you so that you can start making different choices in your life. And so some of the things that I look at to make this more practical when it comes to different choices, because it is about making different choices for yourself. And the cool thing is that you can restructure all of this. You can restructure the impact that your genetic code has had on you without you even knowing it. And so first of all, we look at habits. So bad habits, smoking as an example, is clearly going to have an impact on those genes and those switches. So by developing good habits, smart habits, you can actually then begin to change the expression of your genes. And so it's just not a matter of, it's a smart thing to do, or it's ethical, or it's moral, or whatever. Your habits will have a very significant impact on the expression of your genes. And so let me just go a little further on this whole genetic thing. Because what's going to be important to understand as well is that when you look at these genes, and even bring it down to just the way a cell functions, is simply this, is that the genes are responding to the environment around them. And so what's around them? We have to ask ourselves that question. What is around the cell, then the nucleus, then the genes that are important? When in essence, there are really only three things. There's the internal chemicals or toxins, that the body creates. Then you have the external toxins, so from the environment. And then what's interesting, and this is perhaps the largest impact that is on these genes and the gene expression, are your thoughts. So imagine your thoughts in chemical form, and these will definitely affect how your genes are actually going to be expressed. And so they've done studies, and it's interesting because if you just take a cell, and if you look at the purpose of a cell, the purpose of the cell is simply to what? Survive. And so when we take the nucleus, that's the part with all the genes and the chromosomes in there, when you take those out of the cells and you put it in a petri dish, that cell will very quickly die unless you do two things. You provide enough nutrients for it to keep on functioning, and you remove the toxins. And so how does that happen, in our own lives? How does that happen in communities and relationships as we relate to other people? And so it's very relevant for us then to appreciate, the impact of the environment around us. And being very cognizant of that is a critical thing in the way that we can affect, our lives. So the other thing then that is important, and I'm losing my train of thought here. I just put all this together today. In fact, I was supposed to have an interviewee today. Unfortunately, I could not make it. So the other thing that I think that's important for us to really appreciate is then how is it that the social environment, as I just mentioned, is really going to impact us? And so looking at things that you can change, how to establish deep relationships, intimate relationships, places where you can be vulnerable, places where you can allow self-expression to happen, where you can explore different ideas, where you can be heard, where you can be witnessed. These kinds of things are important because that will also help restructure, what's going on with you. And again, it's that restructuring of how we are today and how we can do that is going to be really, really important. There's another part that's actually important, and it has to do with, how is it that we interpret things? The brain actually asks three questions all the time. What am I focusing on? What does it mean? And what am I going to do? But if we focus on the first two as an example, right, there's a lot that we can actually do with that. We can change the meaning, and that's called reframing. We can actually reframe the meaning of something. And what I found brilliantly successful is that when you're not liking a certain experience, let's put it that way, right? It's never about the actual event. It's always about the meaning that we give something. So what if we could give it a greater meaning? What if we could make this a better meaning? What if what you would once call the worst time in your life can actually become the best time in your life? And so part of that process, which is then helpful, is simply the language that we use. What language are you using to explain the experience to yourself and perhaps to others? And language is everything. And so the best way to hack our own brain is to begin to use what I call better language, empowering language, generative language, wisdom language, all these different things, so that it elevates basically your energy levels. It elevates your level of consciousness into a place that says, okay, great, I'm going to use this kind of language so that I can more easily identify or acknowledge the great things that are around me. For the longest period of time, with one of my coaches, I couldn't get used to the fact about the question she would typically ask, what's great? What's great about your life right now? And what's great about you? It took me about 10 years to finally admit to myself, well, yeah, maybe there is something great about me. Maybe there is something great about this moment. And as I coach people today, they also struggle with that. But because I knew how much I struggled with that, I help them appreciate a better vocabulary so that they can restructure the way that they look at things as well. So the other part that's really important is, what kind of questions do we ask? And it all relates to something that's absolutely fundamental with how we actually show up. And that is, asking better questions. When you ask a bad question, or when you ask yourself a lousy question, then typically what's going to happen is that you're going to get a lousy answer. If you choose to ask yourself, look, what's wrong with me? Why can't I lose weight? Or why can't, I ever succeed? Why am I such a loser? I mean, the truth is that oftentimes, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, we're wired to see what's wrong. And it's hard then in those moments to flip the switch and really decide, okay, what's great about this? And so that's where we have to ask better questions. And that concept I learned from a brilliant man called Tony Robbins, because he would state the quality of life is the quality of questions. He would define quality of life in many different ways. And the quality of life is the quality of emotions. And so another question that I think is absolutely brilliant, and all of this, remember, has to do with understanding how is it that we actually got here today. It's not going on that path of psychoanalysis, because I don't think that's going to be really helpful, unless you're having really major challenges. But for most of us, but even people with major challenges, the whole concept of neurolinguistic programming or neuroassociative conditioning, whatever you prefer, is a brilliant science or technology view of communication. How is it that we communicate with ourselves? How is it that we communicate with the world around us? How is it that we process the information? And then what's the programming and the neurology that delivers behavior? Because ultimately, it's always about behavior. But the starting point always has to be with developing this high sense of awareness. Now, you look at the most successful people, and they have certain qualities. One of them is sensory acuity, self-awareness. They're aware of themselves. They're aware of how they show up. One of the coolest breakthroughs that I had, I was going to a humanitarian trip to Ecuador, about 2015, I think it was. And this is the first time I was going with a completely strange group of people. Had no clue who they were, where they were coming from, and going to a different country. And so sometimes, that's a little overwhelming, even for somebody that's a seasoned traveler as myself, because all these things are started going through your head. And, am I going to like these people? Am I going to like this trip? Is it going to be worth my time and spending a lot of money? All these promises were made, all these different thoughts. And so I finally came to the realization that the best part of this, and in fact, the best part of anything, is to have the ability to recognize what's going on inside of you in any kind of situation. Is having that sensory acuity and the willingness to acknowledge, as Eckhart Tolle, talks about, the power of now. Just simply acknowledge, what's going on inside of you, whether it's a very generative, positive, uplifting feeling, or just one that's really heavy, one that's disempowering, one that just doesn't feel good. I don't use the word the positive and negative. I think that's kind of meaningless, right? Because, in a sense, having a heavy feeling could be a positive in the sense it gets you to have leverage to make a shift. And it's about changing the structure of how we look at our lives and how we choose to program our lives as well. And so, how are you showing up? You know, the best place to actually begin that process, I found, was when you're judging others. You know, one of my first steps way back when was my mantras: no judgment, no judgment, no judgment. Because what is it that you're doing then as well? You're actually not judging other people. I'm sorry, you're not judging yourself. I got that wrong. So you're not judging yourself. And it's important not to do that. And so that's where I have this beautiful epiphany. And this is kind of the beginning of the genesis of everything that I've been doing. Because after 2015, that's when it really started rolling, you know, with my personal transformation work and sharing that with others. I've been in the world of personal transformation for the last 18 years. I mean, it was a whole new dimension. After 17 years training in medicine and then going into practice, I had no clue this concept of this dimension of personal development. What a breath of fresh air, because when I walked into this space, it was one of realizing, wow, I could be everything I want to be. And that's true for all of us, is now having that realization that if you don't like where you are today, if you don't like who you are, then it's time to make different decisions. And it starts off with discovering now how you got here. And this is the purpose of this talk today. And so, as Eckhart Tolle talks about, the power of now is simply acknowledging what's going on, not judging your emotion, and then having the ability to transmute that or transform that in a way that really supports you. But there's a key. There's a little hack that I came up with that really works well for me. And when I share with people, it actually really works well for them too. And that is, give yourself permission to be human. That's all that it is. You've got to give yourself permission to be just you. You know, we're so caught up in being the right person, the right way, doing the right thing. And I still get caught up in that, you know, because there's a lot of misconceptions that are still muddling in my head. And I'm sure they're muddling in yours in one way or another, because the way that we know that it's not muddling you up is when you're really happy, you're fulfilled, you're on fire, you know, whatever that is for you. You know, life is blissful. And it's not the one where you're in denial. And I think there's a lot of people out there that just choose to be in a denial. They have this affirmation, you know, like, and I like the one Tony talks about. It's there's no weeds, there's no weeds, there's no weeds. Well, freaking hell, there are weeds out there. You know, but that's where what I celebrate my faults and my weaknesses. Not to justify them in any shape or form, but simply then to acknowledge that they're there, and it's something that I can now actually work on. And so as we move along, and I'm looking at my notes here, and they're all scribbled in there, and they're hard to read. So one of the things that we have to appreciate then, besides the genetic code and the switches and everything else, is that you were born at some point. And you were in gestation too for about 9 months. And just think of all the influences over time. Your mom's thoughts, the chemicals she consumed, the kinds of activities she underwent. So all of that had something to do, you know, with the structural building of your body and your mind. You know, what's interesting is when you look at humans, and I believe we're the species that stays longest, you know, with their mother. I think orcas and elephants, they typically stay within their tribe, their family, forever. But as a single unit, I think humans stay the longest. And So there's a lot of development that's happening during this period of time. First of all, physiologically, the first several months of a baby after being born, I think the number is like 1 million neurons are created every single second. So you can only imagine that in that time, especially the first 3 years, the expansion of the brain and its capabilities, and as a baby, you're learning new languages. And so what does that really mean? It means that you're ripe to be influenced by your environment around you. And as an immature brain, you don't have the ability to actually filter that stuff. And so whatever comes in basically becomes, in essence, like legend. It's there. And so one of the challenges that I feel that we all have, in this world of being a victim, we're all victims. And I call it victims of misconception. Because what happens is that our immature brain at that time isn't able to effectively process the information that comes in and makes a meaning out of it. Remember, we're talking about the brain, the second question the brain asks, and that is, what does this mean? And so if the brain then makes a meaning that's is inaccurate or inappropriate, and what's going to happen is this is just going to carry on through life. And so my own story, which is kind of interesting, and that was after going through all this personal development and learning all these things, doing NLP, doing these courses, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm a doctor. Why don't I go visit the psychologist and see what I can get out of there? And that turned out to be quite a bust because I think I knew more than the psychologist at the time. Or maybe I just didn't like what he had to say. And there certainly was one thing I just didn't like what he said. And that he was blaming my parents to have traumatized me. And I thought to myself, that's not possible. I had the best parents in the world. And I had the best youth in the world. And I had so many amazingly cool experiences and everything else. And there's a bunch of stories I won't share. But the truth is, yes, I was traumatized. And in fact we're all traumatized. Not by any particular intent, but because as an immature brain, we make something mean that it's not. And so take the example of a 3-month-old. And it's now got used to, when it has its hunger pangs, and now suddenly, it gets fed. Doesn't know where it's coming from, but there's food coming in. Well, what about that moment when it's not there? What about that moment when your mom is taking care of little Johnny because he scraped his knee? So mom couldn't attend to you. That's traumatic. And so many of these events have happened over time. And the thing that's a challenge for us then is simply this, is that whatever meaning we gave that, and it's buried deep in our unconscious mind, is manifesting itself in our adulthood. And even without our knowing it. And there's a process that happens after this that I'm going to describe in a moment. But what's critically important for us as adults then is that if we're not resonating, or if we're not vibing with whatever's happening around us because it's a way that somebody's behaving or a certain experience, or you're watching somebody on TV, whatever it is, somewhere, somehow that makes sense. Not that it's right. Not that it's necessarily supporting you in the best possible way. But in the science of neurolinguistic programming, we have this understanding. And the unconscious mind, really that actually runs the show. It's running your heart, your digestion, everything. And it has what we call primary directives. And one of the primary directives of the unconscious mind is that all behavior is motivated by positive intent. So everything we're doing is motivated by positive intent. But it's based on our beliefs and values and decisions and experiences and all the programming, all that software that's in there that's ingrained, unconscious, and oftentimes misconceived. And so while something may not be good for you, somewhere, somehow, you're driven because there's this idea that it's the right thing for you. And so all these ideas, these things are modifiable. We can change these. And again, it's understanding that our behavior makes sense. It's based on the programming. It's based on the software. And somehow, we can change it. And that's a whole different discussion that's going through my head right now as far as, okay, how do we get that leverage? But that's for later on. For now, just appreciate the fact that if you're not happy with where you are today, and let me tell you, if you're not healthy, if you're overweight, you've got bad habits, I can't imagine that deep down you're really happy with those. But somewhere, somehow they make sense that these are happening. So when we go back and appreciate the fact that we're getting these concepts, and now that they're misconceptions, the more traumatic, the more significant emotional event that happens, the more that it's going to be ingrained in our unconscious, and the more impactful it's going to be in how we show up in our lives. And so what's important to appreciate in that as well is all the conditioning that happened afterwards. And I got my list here of all the things that cause the conditioning, because it's the conditioning that really reinforces that programming, those beliefs, those values. And so the conditioning that I'm looking at is, if the meme, as we call it, right? The meme is an idea of how should I put it? It's just a thought, right? It's just a concept. It's just a belief. And so if that repeats itself over and over again, that's part of the conditioning. When you have confirming events, so the event happens basically, or an event happens around that confirms that belief or that necessity or that value. Another one is this, we're creatures, social creatures. We have to have the sense of belonging. And so these memes then, with the need to belong, to have safety, to have connection, could be a powerful thing for us to maintain these misconceptions. Other emotionally enforcing or reinforcing events. And one of them is fear. So there could be a variety of different reasons fear shows up that simply then reinforces that conditioning, that belief, that meme. Here's another one which is interesting. And that is when we stop questioning, when we stop asking, when we stop being inspired. And I call that the broken spirit. And that's because somewhere, somehow, someone is telling us, don't bother. You can't do this. Don't think. Don't ask. Don't be yourself. And so then we get into this, what's called a contracted state. And so appreciating how these things can actually show up in your life, just reinforcing these memes, these ideas, these misconceptions, you can just actually rewire all of that. Another one is necessity, and another one is our values. So how our values then show up, because we might value certain things in a certain way. So when it comes to this whole process of conditioning, and I lost my notes again. I was really organized today, and I'm learning as I'm watching other guys do these long talks that they mess up all the time. So that means I can mess up too. Okay, I lost my page altogether. So when we talk about, let's see. All right. So a lot of different things come to mind as we navigate the world around us. And one of them is what's called modeling. And so how we get some of these ideas, these misconceptions, is through modeling. And one of the brilliant things about babies is that we're excellent modelers. Because have you ever noticed, for example, when you hang around somebody that you really like, that you really respect, and then you start talking like them, you start using the same mannerisms. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we are wired for survival. But survival happens in a lot of different ways. And so, as the cell needs to survive, right? Structurally, it's in essence, it's connected to other cells, to other organs. And so, like, we are connected with other people and communities. And so the complexity of life today and the complexity of our physiology today is all about surviving. So every cell in your body has a function. So why not ourselves? Why not have a purpose? And so when we relate to the world around us, it's important for us to be connected with our purpose. And so having that purpose extends from survival to thriving. And so for me, thriving is what's called spiritual survival. And so in today's world, if we're not thriving, if we don't have that spiritual survival part within us, then we're not being the best version of ourselves either. We're not happy. We're not fulfilled. We're in these heavy states of scarcity, of fear, of apathy, all these different things. And the truth is, we're not really wired to be that way. And when we're relying on the different misconceptions that have happened in our lives, it's easy to get stuck. So one of the key essentials in making these changes is looking at all the different structural places that we can start making the changes in our life. So one of the easiest ones is changing what's going into your body. It's your nutrition. It's what you consume as far as fluids. But here's the part that oftentimes we just absolutely forget. And I'm not talking about drugs. It's the environment. So when we appreciate what's in our environment, I mean, I was shocked when I heard this number, and this is a number that's probably 10 years old by now, is that there's 350,000 different environmental toxins. So ask yourself right now, where do you spend most of your time? Now, if you're like me, that's in bed. Well, think about it. 8 hours a day, I need 8 hours of sleep. So 8 hours, I'm sleeping in a bed. Where's my head? It's on a pillow. On my pillow, I've got a sheet, or a pillowcase, I should say. So that pillowcase is washed in a detergent. Now, for probably many, many years of my life, I'm using detergents that were probably somewhat toxic when I inhaled them. So we have to be cognizant of things like this. Is that how is the environment actually impacting us? And so again, it's about understanding and appreciating the fact that if you're not happy with where you are right now, you start looking at some of the structural things that you can change. The physiology is one of them. Take this other one, chlorine. Where do you think we get most of our chlorine? It's not in the water that we drink. It's actually in the showers. And so making some basic changes that will absolutely help you. Now, it's perhaps not that easy to change your water, or perhaps not that easy to leave the city that's polluted. But there's certainly a lot of other things that you can make better, wiser choices in. So what that does, as I was talking about earlier, is that it will affect the switches of your genes. Turn off the right switches, your body's going to function better. You can blame your parents, understand, what kind of decisions they made, and so that you can actually make better decisions yourself. So I'm slowly going to wrap this up and remind everyone that it's entirely up to you to begin to develop this awareness of, number one, who you are and where you are in your life. It's important to take inventory of what's going on. And the inventory that you want to take in are two things, essentially. Where are you now? And where is it that you want to go? It's great to know where you came from, right? Because there's a lot of clues in that as to how it is that you got to where you are today, and definitely might help you figure out where you want to go tomorrow. But it requires a lot of courage and honesty in yourself to take inventory of where are you today. What are the things that you're taking for granted? Who are the people that you haven't talked to that need to be talked to? And not talk to in that way, but what is it that you need to tell them? Great exercise that I learned from my coach the other day is, let's say you only have one day to live. Who would you call up? What would you tell them? What would you want them to know? What's important for them to realize about you and what you thought about them and how grateful you are for them, or perhaps, how proud you are of them. Yeah, that was a heart stopper for me. He says, oh, wow. And then right away I called up a whole bunch of people. Well, here's the other one. What if you had 6 months to live? What would you do with those last 6 months? The point that we're getting at is, what is it that you're forgetting to do that's important in your life? So take stock, take inventory of where you are today. For the most part, I'm really enjoying my life. And the stress that I have is because I'm not going fast enough in accomplishing certain things, because I've got this pile of stuff that I'm wanting to do. And all these promises that I've made people, obligations I've taken upon myself, and realize that I can't work fast enough or smart enough, or maybe I just don't know how to delegate or use leverage or whatever it is. So that's where my stress comes from. And I think that's kind of a decent stress, because it really forces me to grow. But it's not a stress of scarcity or fear of anything else. And so I'm really excited and happy that I get to do all the things that I really want to do. So it requires that honesty and acknowledgement and giving yourself permission to be human, and simply by stating, look, okay, I've got these faults. I can work on these things. It doesn't make me a bad person. right? There's a reason. I can blame my parents if I want, but I've got to take responsibility in making the changes now. You don't like your life, make new decisions. That's up to you. You know, one of the other qualities of very successful people is accountability. They take responsibility for where they are today. They don't blame anybody else. In fact, here's another Tonyism that I like. You know, effectively thank other people for giving you a hard time. Because maybe it's because of them that you're here today. You know, my biology teacher, Dr. Mendelsohn, if you happen to be listening, back from Wales, you know, he looked at me straight in the face when I was back in college and says, you know what? Don't even bother going into medicine because you're never going to make it. Well, I'm happy to say that I'm doing pretty good in it. I've been in it for 20 years, and now I'm doing stem cell surgeries in the world and changing people's lives and really tapping into some brilliant medicine, if you will. And I call that, you know, brain intelligence, body intelligence, as well as energy intelligence. So these are all the cool things that I'm getting to do for the world around. And in a way, I need to thank him for triggering me and putting some fire in the work that I was doing. So maybe he did it on purpose. I don't know. So the point is that being responsible starts with having that awareness. But then the other part that's key, and that's part of the program that I'm working on, is what is that target? You see, again, most successful people are very clear. Now I'm actually getting ready for an event, and I learned the hard way that going to events, going to retreats, you know, when you sign up for these things, you think to yourself, oh, great, you know, it's going to be transformative. And if you don't go in prepared, really you're at the mercy of what shows up. And so, yeah, you can have this argument, well, I'll just be open and see what happens. But there's a really neat definition of luck. And luck is when opportunity meets preparedness. So the more work, the more preparedness, the more you think about what it is that you want in life, the more that it's going to come to you. You know, people are critical of others, says, oh, you want too much. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, it might be wrong if it's at the expense of others. But if other people are not doing the work and you are, and you get the apple, the reward, well, that's on them. That's not on you. So this is where we have to be clear when you go into these kinds of events, any kind of event. It's all about life. Is what are your outcomes? What is it that you want? And what's the underlying reason to want this? What's the drive? What's the purpose? See, the work that I've done over the years, it's about creating change, enhancing life, and developing peaceful awareness. I just love helping people. I just love connecting people. I just love, you know, integrating modern wisdom with ancient wisdom. And then see where that falls, and have us have a new type of wisdom that really is what I call tapping into that collective wisdom and creating the space for generative collaboration. So where are you in all of this? As we understand where we come from. Where do you come from? It's your genetics. It's a genetic code. It's the epigenetics. It's how you've switched on and switched off those switches over time. It's how your parents, your ancestors, switched on and switched off those switches. You know, if you believe in past lives, you know, what are we when we're gone? What is our soul? You know, not to get all religious and spiritual here, but the truth is that some people have very strong feelings about this. So this relates to you. What is that energy transfer through time? You know, this is a part of our existence that few of us really understand at any level of consciousness. But it's there. We are energies. So exposure during birth, what happens at birth? The impact of that happened then. And even though you can't change that, you can restructure the effects that have happened to you over time. What are those misconceptions? You know, what was your upbringing like? Were you nurtured? Were you cared for? And all these determine what you believe in. They determine how you show up. Things like jealousy, envy, hatred, fear, apathy, scarcity. They all come from somewhere. You know, I have my own personal experience, and it's an interesting one. And I relate it to an experience I had when I was a kid. And I'm not sure if I made it up, and I should ask my brothers if they're listening on this one. But I would go to the store all excited because, you know, I'm going to get all these healthy foods, restructure my body, give it the right nutrition. And then when I get home, I wouldn't do anything with them. You know, fortunately now I'm married, and so it's a lot easier, right? My wife really encourages me. She reminds me, yeah, you got all this fruit and vegetables, you better eat them. She's very good at that. But I think what happened, I can relate to a story of myself when I was a little kid, and I went into the fridge and took out all the fruits and vegetables because I realized I thought that was a good thing, and I was going to make something special out of it. And then I was shamed. I was shamed by either my parents or my brothers. And so unconsciously that would show up later on in life. Maybe it's a story I made up, but it made sense to me. And so where can it make sense to you? Remember the memes, the misconceptions, these thoughts, these ideas that you've been infected with over time that are running the show right now. They run politics, they run religion, they run interactions with other people, they run your relationships. So if you're not on fire, if you're not resonating, if you're not vibrating at the highest level where you want to be, if you're not the best version of yourself, then something's stopping you. And so it's worthwhile to start looking at those things. Look at your past. Not to stay stuck in there. Not to stay in the past. You know, some people are driving looking in the rear mirror. That's not going to work. You're going to crash pretty quickly. But appreciating, just having the appreciation that the way that you're showing up today makes sense. It comes from somewhere. And if you're not liking it, you got to change it. You went through a lot of different conditioning over time. Get some new conditioning. And so seek out programs. I'm creating a program for your prescription, for your transformation, so that you can change your life and start living your life by your prescription, the one that you write, not somebody else. You're using your map, your ideas, your resources, your resonance, your vibration. Because you deserve to live the life on your terms, the one that you desire, where you can tap into what I call your authentic genius, the best version of yourself. That's in there. There's an amazing person. There's greatness, there's magnificence inside of every single person. It's no different than Michelangelo. You know, they said to him, no, you're such a genius, and in those, you've created something beautiful. And I think his answer was, I just chipped it out of there. I just chipped it out of the stone. What is it that you need to chip away to find your grandness, your beauty? So with that, what's your prescription for your life? How do you want to change it? And ultimately, who's going to help you change it? Find the right people, find the right resources, find the right event, find the right program. out there. There's so many out there that will absolutely transform your life. I'm Dr. Bart Rademaker, prescription for your transformation. Real people, real conversations, real success, reminding you too that it's about tapping into your authentic genius, and you are capable of more, and you are capable of better. Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Dr. Rademaker's Prescription for Transformation. Join Dr. Bart Rademaker live right here on Radio Star Worldwide each week, or on demand 24/7.